Hello everyone and welcome back to another tutorial video, and in today's video, part 3 of drawing Jordan Peterson's hair, we will be refining some of the foundation that we established in the previous video. So let's dive right into it. So for the next few minutes, I'll be just following the same step from part 2, where I'm using the Tombow Mono Zero Eraser to erase in some of those lighter hairs. So where you see me go back in with this brush to add a little bit of a darker layer of charcoal powder where I've already highlighted some of the lighter hairs with the eraser. The reason for this is because not every section of this side of the hair is the same tone and doesn't have the overall same level of brightness. So there's some little areas between these whiter hairs that are a little bit darker, and if I erased every single hair into that more uniform charcoal layer that I had established before, I would have to then come in with a pencil and manually make the places between those hairs either a little bit darker or lighter. But instead, just try to stay a step ahead during this process before erasing in those lighter hairs with the Tombow eraser. I always want to make sure that that little section of the background is a more accurate value to what it's going to be, so that I don't have to then later come in and try to darken the tones between those hairs after the fact. And it would be a lot more work to try to do that later with a pencil, manually trying to go in between all the hairs. So it makes much more sense to make sure that that little section of background behind that little section of hair is the right value before you even try to erase any little hairs into it. And layering is also very important here as well. Sometimes you're going to want to do what I'm doing here and erase those hairs in, and then cover a little bit of a section of that hair with a light layer of charcoal, and then come back in and erase some lighter hairs on top of that layer. And you can kind of layer these hairs with the charcoal powder on top of each other. And just kind of following that process of erasing some hairs in and then covering up a slight area of part of that section of hair, and then erasing some whiter hairs back on top of that again. So I hope I don't sound like I'm contradicting myself, in the sense that you don't want to come back and add that charcoal powder on top, potentially messing up some of the hairs that you've already erased into that charcoal powder. But there is a difference if you're purposely coming in and just partially covering up a little part of that hair on purpose to then add some more white hairs into that layer after the fact. Now, one thing you'll notice as well, I pull my eraser away after 1 or 2 strokes, and this is because I'm either wiping off the layer of charcoal that is now on the eraser, or I'm using scissors to cut a fresh new tip every few strokes so that I can maintain that really sharp edge, just like what I'm doing here. and sometimes the little layer of charcoal behind and in between the hairs that I've erased into it is a little bit too dark. So coming in with a kneaded eraser is a good strategy for lightening up the tone behind those hairs now that I've already erased them in. It's a lot more difficult to get the tone behind and in between those hairs to be a little bit darker than it is to lighten it up after the fact. And the reason for that is because when you use that kneaded eraser, you're lifting off some of that charcoal between those hairs, but you've already erased that line into the page, so you're not going to make the hairs any lighter, but you will be making that value between those hairs a little bit lighter. But on the flip side, the opposite is more difficult, because if you were to make that little part between those hairs darker with some charcoal powder, the hairs would then of course also become darker, because you can't just add that charcoal powder between the hairs, but you can use the kneaded eraser to make the whole thing lighter without affecting those hairs you just erased into it. So now that we've established as strong a foundation as possible in terms of the charcoal powder base layer, and then erasing those hairs with the Tombow Mono Zero Eraser after the fact, and playing around with the brush and adding different layers of erasing and charcoal powder, we're going to come in with the General's Charcoal White and focus on some of those lighter hairs. And the reason you don't just want to start with the General's Charcoal White and you actually want to erase all of these hairs in first is because if you just rely on the General's Charcoal White, it's going to turn out very blue, and the Charcoal White applies much better on top of the actual paper than it does on top of the charcoal. So you're going to get a much whiter hair erasing them all in, and then coming in between some of those erased marks with the charcoal white after the fact, and then making them even whiter. So I'm not going to be doing these with all the hairs, but just the ones that are particularly whiter. And when you're satisfied with those steps and you feel like you've highlighted the whitest hairs and you feel like the lighter sections of the hair are taken care of, it's then time to come back on top with the graphite or a pit oil pencil and add those darker strands of hair now on top of all the work that you just did. Because if you were to do these hairs first, of course you'd be erasing through them, and some of these darker hairs do visually appear to be on top anyway, so it makes sense to do them last. And as a finishing touch, it might also be a good idea to come in with some graphite pencil or a pit oil based pencil and add some definition in some of these darker cracks between the hairs as well. Anyway, those are the basic steps that I use to complete the hair of Jordan Peterson, and you can still come in between these cracks like I'm doing here and add a little bit more detail, but those are the main steps that I would recommend following for this type of hair. Anyway, that concludes today's tutorial, part 3 of Jordan Peterson's hair. I hope you guys learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in that next video.